Hi folks, welcome to Behind the Numbers Around the World, an eMarketer podcast brought to you by VTEX. It's Tuesday, August the 31st, and I'm your host, UK Principal Analyst Bill Fisher. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to Around the World with Olympic and Sports Broadcasting. Welcome everyone to a Behind the Numbers show that takes you around the world looking at what other countries are doing in the worlds of commerce, media and advertising. Every month, we take a topic and I ask a couple of our international experts to fill us in on what's happening in their markets. Today, we'll be looking at how the Olympic Games coverage was broadcast and consumed around the world.
In Canada, traditionally, the focus is on live events, and if a 100-meter final is at 9 in the morning, it will be broadcast live on Canadian TV at that particular time. There'll be lots of promotion of the fact that this event is happening at that time.
What that might mean for the fast-approaching Winter Olympics in Beijing.
So organizers are promoting this as the first game where 5G will be deployed in a large scale. So we can expect perhaps robots or drones shot videos, really futuristic stuff.
And what sports rights deals in general look like in different countries. Now, some of you might have already forgotten about the delayed 2020 Tokyo Olympic Games. The closing ceremony was at the beginning of the month after all, but we're only halfway through, of course. The Paralympic Games kicked off last week, and there's still plenty of sporting content to be consumed there. Plus, we have the Winter Olympics hot on the heels of the summer event, all thanks to pandemic delays. That kicks off in a little over 5 months' time, if you can believe it. But how do people tune into the Olympics? How will they tune into the Winter Olympics? And how will they tune into sports going forwards? In the first half of today's show, I'll be speaking with our Canada expert, Paul Briggs, to ask him those very questions. Then in the second half of the show, I'll be asking the same to our Asia Pacific specialist, Man-Chung Cheung. So without further ado, let's meet our first guest. He is our principal analyst for Canada, and I imagine he's looking forward to the Winter Olympics slightly more than I am, because Canada are quite competitive in a number of events. It's Paul Briggs. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Bill. It's great to be here. And yes, the Winter Olympics hold a special place in the hearts of Canadians for sure. A lot of that has to do with hockey, but also all the snow that you see when you watch the Olympics in the winter.
Absolutely. We have too much rain, not enough snow. That's why we're so bad at it. But you guys did pretty well in the Summer Olympics as well. I followed the women's soccer, who, of course, you guys won it, which was an incredible achievement.
Yeah, that was an amazing story. And the Winter Olympics traditionally has been a stronghold for Canada as a country. But in recent, quadrennials, the Summer Olympics have really performed. Canada has performed really well in the Summer Olympics as well, which is great news if you're living in this part of the world.
It is indeed. Now, before we get into the meat of today's discussion, there is time for a Britishism, which I like to introduce on these shows. And given we're talking about sports today, I went for a related phrase. It's one that you probably will know, but I'm interested if you know where it derives from. The phrase is sticky wicket. Do you know what that means?
Does it have something to do with the sport of cricket?
It does indeed. Well done.
Okay.
Good knowledge. It come to mean a difficult situation. So if you are playing on a sticky wicket, it's difficult to traverse. It is from the wonderful game of cricket, that quintessential English sporting pastime. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the sport itself, because I would literally need the entire episode to explain how cricket works. But essentially, the main action in a game of cricket takes place on a very narrow strip of very, very short grass in the middle of the field, which is referred to as the wicket. And that's where bowlers steam in and fling a ball at close to 100 miles an hour at an opposition batsman who has to try and fend it away. Now, balls must bounce on the wicket before it reaches the batsman for it to be deemed a legal delivery, broadly speaking. So the condition of the wicket is really important in a game of cricket. And if there is moisture on the pitch, it can become a little bit glutinous, and it is described as a sticky wicket. And the way the ball bounces off the wicket becomes much more erratic. And so the phrase sticky wicket literally means the situation of the batter is made much more difficult. So there you go, a bit of word etymology for you there. And don't worry, Paul, I won't be sending down any difficult deliveries for you today, so you should be fine.
Thank you, Bill.
Anyway, enough of that. Let's get into the matter at hand. So, Paul, it was a very unique Olympics this year. How did Canadians react? How did they tune in to watch the Olympics?
Right. So the really interesting aspect of Olympic coverage in Canada is how different it is compared to even 10 years ago. So the options for watching the Olympics there's so many options. They can watch it in digital channels. You can watch it on traditional broadcast channels, through social media. Overall, when you look at the broadcast ratings, viewership was down fairly significantly overall compared to the Rio Olympics in 2018. A lot of that had to do with the time zone change. It was a 13-hour difference, so that's a big factor as well. But when you look at the amount of digital consumption of content, that was up significantly compared to the 2018 Pyeongchang Olympics. So 62% increase of streamed video views for these Olympics compared to Pyeongchang in 2018. So people are definitely turning to digital channels to really get their Olympic fix.
And what about the timing? So obviously it was a little bit difficult given that the event was it was on the other side of the world in Japan. But I know in the prep for today's call, you spoke about how Canadians like to consume Olympic coverage compared to maybe how your cousins over the border do. And there's a bit of a difference, right?
Yeah, it really goes down to the broadcaster approach. So traditionally in the US, especially with NBC, they really focus on prime time curation of a story for the day. So they will take that 3 or 4 hour block in prime time and tell a story regardless of live feeds, regardless of live events. Whereas in Canada, traditionally, the focus is on live events. And if a 100-meter final is at 9 in the morning, it will be broadcast live on Canadian TV at that particular time. There'll be lots of promotion of the fact that this event is happening at that time. So it's a marked difference between how the Canadian rights holder, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC handles it versus how NBC has traditionally handled it.
Yeah. So, and that 13-hour time difference, was it?
Yep.
Yeah. So I guess that kind of got in the way a little bit with regards to uptake on traditional broadcast channels.
Yeah, that certainly had an impact on the traditional broadcast ratings for sure. And that's why it was down compared to Rio for sure.
Yeah. What about for advertisers and broadcasters, though? Did they still get a lot out of the games this year?
According to reports from the network and also their brand partners, they were very happy to have live, relevant content coming out of a really fallow period of sporting content for sort of the last 12 to 18 months. So while the sports leagues have recommenced, this particular focus on Olympic content, which is very lucrative for brand partners, all reports suggested that it was a very good year for them.
Yeah. And if we can just move the conversation over to the rights and who had the rights for the Olympics this year, can you just round that conversation out for me for Canada?
Sure. Yeah. So the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, has the rights, but it's interesting how in the past it would be a sort of solitary effort by the CBC, or in previous games it was CTV was a rights holder. There's a much more broader coalition of media partners that combine to make content available on multiple platforms. So the CBC sub-licenses its rights to the two major sports networks in Canada, TSN and Rogers Sportsnet. So what that basically meant was that content was on all the major sporting television outlets because of the spirit of cooperation. And this goes back to the 2010 games, where there was a broadcasting consortium developed in Canada to make sure that as much Olympic content could be made available to Canadians as possible. So media companies that were traditionally competitive were more cooperative, and that's what we're seeing as well to this day. So the other interesting thing is the fact that Amazon Prime Video partnered with the CBC to make the CBC live feed available on the streaming service. So that was a very unique aspect to the Canadian market. I think Prime Video only made that deal with CBC. So it just gave people who didn't have a cable subscription, or people who didn't have the ability to get the CBC over the air, if they had an internet connection, they could watch it via Amazon Prime Video.
Remind me, does CBC carry advertising?
CBC does carry advertising, yes.
Okay, so that's kind of unique then. So Amazon was streaming stuff that carried advertising.
Correct, yeah.
interesting stuff. Let's stick with broadcast rights then, and let's look beyond the Olympics. What are some of the biggest, I mean, you've already alluded to this, but what are some of the biggest sports in Canada that are carried on TV, and how are the rights for programming sort of divvied up?
Sure. I think obviously the largest sport for the Canadian audience typically is hockey. It's men's hockey in the National Hockey League. It's Olympic hockey for men and women. So it's a very lucrative property for a rights holder to have. We're in the middle right now of a 12-year deal between Rogers Media and the NHL. That started in 2014 to carry national rights for the NHL in Canada. There's also regional rights that are also divvied out, but the national rights are with Rogers Media, and they sort of wrested those away from the CBC back in 2014. The value of that deal was $5.2 billion over 12 years, so roughly $430 million annually. So it shows you the value of that particular rights deal to Canadian advertisers and to Canadian media companies. For comparison's sake, the NHL just did a rights deal for the U.S. market. So starting next year, ESPN and TNT will be handling the national rights for the NHL. The value of that deal is about 800 million Canadian. So it's interesting to see that 2x of the U.S. market in terms of 800 million versus 430 million in terms of the annual rights deals for the NHL. It's not that much different when you consider that the U.S. market is like 10 times the size of the Canadian market. So it just underlines the fact that it's a very lucrative rights package for a media company to have in Canada.
Well, what about any of the major streaming providers? I mean, you mentioned Amazon carrying some of the Olympics coverage. Are they getting involved in any big way in Canadian sports?
Not specifically Amazon. DAZN, spelled DAZN, out of Europe. They made some news a couple of years ago by securing the rights to English Premier League soccer for Canada for several years. That's been going on in the market for a couple of years now. That was taken away from traditional broadcast rights holders. So that was a fairly innovative type rights package at the time. In terms of streaming hockey, Rogers, who has that national rights holder, they have an NHL app that they market that allows you to watch every game. They also have something called Sportsnet Now, which is a streaming app for their sports network. So there is an ability to catch NHL hockey in streaming apps, but it's not quite where it is in the US, where, for example, ESPN Plus has a much greater degree of adoption.
Okay. And we mentioned at the top of the show, we do have the Winter Olympics fast approaching in Beijing. So we're looking at similar time difference for Canadians, although there might be a bit more interest, so they might get out of bed to watch this sort of stuff. Given everything we've discussed so far, what sort of trends do you think we can expect to see, perhaps from a consumption viewership angle first?
Yeah, I think we're going to continue to see the rise of live streaming via digital channels across all the sports. I think that 62% increase over the last Olympics that was experienced this year in Tokyo, I think we're going to see a similar type progression in terms of the amount of content people consume digitally. The big story for Canada here is whether or not the National Hockey League goes to Beijing, and that's still a question that's up in the air. The IOC and the NHL are still negotiating the terms of that participation. If the NHL goes to Beijing, what that essentially means is that the best players in the world are playing in the Olympic format. And as a result, ratings will be much higher in Canada and elsewhere, I would imagine, as well. So that decision, which is pending still, will have a big impact on how National Hockey League fans tune into the Olympics in Beijing.
So looking at it from the other angle, assuming that they do have the NHL guys there, what sort of impact might that have on the rights holders, or will it have any impact? Will it still continue with CBC?
It's still the CBC. So they will continue to use the same approach of multi-channel content delivery for all the sports, including hockey. I think what you will see is a very rich package of content that they will develop around the hockey tournament in Beijing, especially if the NHL is there.
And do you think they'll use the same approach, though, where folks still want to watch it live, or might we see a move to something more US-like, where things are packaged?
It's been so long that the CBC and CTV, the other major rights holder in Canada for the Olympics over the years, their approach has always been live content, generates the most ratings, generates the most engagement with consumers. So I don't think we're going to see that change anytime soon.
Okay. Well, Paul, thank you very much. It's always great to hear from you. Really interesting to hear about some of the sports viewing trends coming out of Canada. We are going to take a quick break now to hear from our sponsor, and then I'll be back with Man-Chung to talk about the situation in Asia Pacific.
Everyone is talking about digital transformation, but what does it mean in real life? Digital Insider is a new podcast series about the digitization of retail, where business leaders, academics, and thinkers discuss how businesses are transforming and give their perspectives, practical advice, thought process, and lessons learned. Go to digitalinsider.com to learn more or listen to it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back, and also welcome to our research analyst for China and Japan, Man-Chung Cheung. Hi, Man-Chung.
Hello, everybody.
So we've heard from Paul about how people in Canada were tuning into the Olympics coverage and how they might tune into sports coverage in future. What about the home nation? Man-Chung, obviously people in Tokyo couldn't attend most of the events in person, so how were they watching the Olympics in Japan?
Yeah, so this Olympic, like all the other Olympics, was not lacking any sort of controversies, right? The public in Japan were deeply ambivalent about the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, with many accusing organizers of caring more for the pockets of corporations than human lives. In reference to the ongoing pandemic, people were also angered by the runaway costs for staging the event. Results from many surveys showed that the majority of Japanese people were opposed to the hosting of the games prior to the opening. However, the opening ceremony drew 56.4% of Japanese households in the Kanto area, where Tokyo is based, to public broadcaster NHK. This is the highest TV viewership in Japan since the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, according to the marketing research company Video Research. Viewership of the closing ceremony was just as impressive. It attracted 46.7% of households in the same region. In all, almost 47 million people in Japan tuned in to watch the closing ceremony. The most viewed sport events, not including the opening and closing, were the men's baseball final between Japan and the US. No surprises there. The men's marathon and the men's soccer semifinal between Japan and Spain.
Okay, what about where people were watching? I mean, what sort of devices, what platforms were people using to tune into the coverage?
Yeah, so in terms of device preferences, the overwhelming majority of people in Japan prefer to watch the games on TV. This is because the typical Japanese homes are much smaller than that in the US. And the family room serves as the focal point for family activities where the TV is always on. The next most popular device to consume the Olympics is smartphone, actually, followed by radio and personal computer. Japan has an aging population, as you know, so that sort of explains the TV's dominance, but it is undeniable that the smartphone is growing on younger generations.
Yeah, is this having an effect on the desired viewing experiences that consumers in Japan want from their sports broadcasting?
Yeah, so definitely, like everywhere else, the divide between the older generation and younger generations are fairly large. So Japan, like everywhere else, media consumption habits is changing with the advance of digital, of course. A polling by NHK showed that 44% of respondents wanted to watch the broadcast sport events anytime on any device. 37% would like events to be streamed on all devices simultaneously. 36% high-quality video such as 4K or 8K. 28% wanted info display on athletes and competition on mobile devices, and 15% chose watching the contest from any angle of their choosing. And other response also includes virtual experiences where they feel like being part of the competition. Now, that's some really, really cutting edge stuff right there.
That is cutting edge. We might not get too deep into that. One thing that I am interested in, though, so when we spoke with Paul in the first half of the show, because of the time difference, video streaming was quite useful. What was the video streaming landscape like in Japan for the Olympics?
So, as we know, there's no time difference for the Tokyo Olympics this time around, but I'm sure it will be very useful going forward. So, in terms of video streaming of the game, it is sort of a fairly nascent phenomenon. The IOC only loosened up online content distribution after the 2004 Athens Olympic, where advances in IP geolocation technology enable protection of broadcasting rights by restricting access from regions outside the scope of broadcasting rights. So before the 2008 Beijing Olympic, the IOC approached the Japan Consortium, which is composed of NHK and a number of commercial broadcasters, to distribute online video. The Japanese side was initially fairly hesitant. They needed to determine what content to stream, the impact that digital video will have on terrestrial TV. In addition, negotiation with sponsors also presented bottlenecks. At the end, though, they budged, fearing that they might lose the streaming rights to YouTube or other online media companies. So now there are three main services that distribute the Olympic Games online in Japan. First, we have the official Olympic Games video distribution site, gorin.jp, gorin.jp, which is a site carrying Olympic-related content all year round. The second one, we have TVR, a very popular OTT platform, and the official commercial TV portal jointly launched by the 5 major commercial TV networks. That includes Nippon TV, TV Asahi, TBS, TV Tokyo, and Fuji Television, which also stream a variety of other types of content from these broadcasters. And last but not least, we have NHK Plus, owned by public broadcaster NHK, which perhaps has the most extensive Olympic coverage among those three options.
Yeah, so actually, I think you've covered a lot regarding the broadcast rights there. Was there any other broadcaster involved in having rights to the coverage?
No, so as I mentioned, there are public broadcaster NHK, the 5 networks, they get lesser right to the content that I mentioned earlier. And yeah, in terms of TV distribution, that's about it.
Okay, so if we stick with broadcast rights for a moment then, but look outside the Olympics, beyond the Olympics, I wonder if you have some insight onto maybe the biggest sports in Japan and what do the broadcast rights look like for those sports?
Yeah, so the top 2 sports in Japan are arguably baseball and soccer. So let me start with baseball. Japan's premier baseball league, Nippon Professional Baseball, in short, NPB, teams sell their media rights individually rather than as a collective, which means each team has a completely different set of deals across terrestrial TVs, satellite TV, as well as radio. Now, DAZN, spelled DAZN, a multinational live sport video on demand subscription service, launched in Japan in 2015 with a British parent company, has streaming deals with 11 of the 12 NPB teams, which it acquired by taking over a local rival in 2018 from SoftBank, a Japanese conglomerate holding company. Now, moving on to soccer, by contrast, the broadcasting rights for the Japan Professional Soccer League, which is called J-League also, the games is managed and relayed by the J-League collectively, and the distribution revenue is divided equally among teams. The length of the contracts are 5 years. So in the latest cycle, which started in 2017, a landmark deal between J-League Soccer and DAZN was reached, giving the latter the broadcasting rights of internet, mobile distribution, IPTV service, pay satellite broadcasting, cable TV, etc. for 10 years between 2017 to 2026. The partnership with DAZN signals that these contents more and more will be consumed through digital devices, particularly to attract younger viewers, of course, and perhaps even hinting on the desire of some of these sporting leagues and teams to attract audiences outside Japan's border, where DAZN operates in about a dozen countries and regions.
And very interesting just to note that your pronunciation of this company differs from Paul's. And I don't have a clue who's right. I don't think that's a good idea for a company if you can't pronounce it.
I'm pronouncing in the Japanese way, so maybe he's the right way.
He was pronouncing it the Canadian way. Where are they from? I forget. They're European, aren't they? Maybe I need to ask someone European. Yeah. Okay. So, Man-Chung, let's look forwards now a little bit. I mentioned the Winter Olympics earlier aren't far away, just a little bit over 5 months away. Given everything we've discussed, do you have any insights as to what all these sort of viewing habits and broadcast rights might mean for the Winter Olympics and for sports in general going forward?
Yeah, we are moving from Tokyo to Beijing this time. So as early as 2014, the media rights in China for the 2018 to 2024 Olympic Games, which include the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics, had already been awarded to state broadcaster CCTV. Those rights span across all platforms from free-to-air TV, subscription TV, internet to mobile.
Okay, just to interrupt briefly there, Man-Chung. So because we've gone to the Winter Olympics in Beijing, you're now talking about in China, right?
That's right.
Okay, perfect. Please continue.
So now CCTV has then sub-licensed the broadcasting rights of the upcoming Winter Games to Tencent and Kuaishou. You might have heard of this name. Maybe you have not, but Tencent has an array of digital properties in its ecosystem, including social networking apps WeChat, of course you know that one, and QQ, Tencent News, as well as OTT streaming sites Tencent Video, WeTV, and Tencent Sports. Kuaishou is a short video app known for its live streaming capability. So in terms of how content might be consumed during the Winter Games, Beijing is eager to showcase its 5G prowess. So organizers are promoting this as the first game where 5G will be deployed in a large scale. So we can expect perhaps robots or drones shot videos, really futuristic stuff, high definition and multi-angle interactive videos, mobile viewing through QR-linked videos, and other cutting-edge viewing experiences.
Wow. I knew you'd come at me with some crazy sci-fi stuff, Man-Chung. That's great.
But we have to wait to see it 6 months from now.
Yeah, and as I said earlier in the show, I'm looking forward to it, perhaps not as much as Paul Briggs is looking forward to it. Man-Chung, thank you very much. That is all we've got time for today on Behind the Numbers Around the World, brought to you by VTEX. Thanks to my guests, Paul and Man-Chung, and thanks to all of you for listening. If you want to ask us any questions, you can, of course, email us at podcast@eMarketer.com. Marcus will be back with you tomorrow with the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast brought to you by VTEX. He hopes to see you there. And my final request for you all is to go off and watch some Paralympic coverage on whatever platform is broadcasting it in your country. See you all next time.